Hello, everybody. It's Friday, August 9th, end of another eventful week in American politics. Things are really heating up. Front page of the New York Times is all about how the election now is real. Harris against Trump, and more people are optimistic that Harris can compete, perhaps even beat Trump. The Washington Post certainly is. But when it comes to optimism about American politics, my guest today might be considered a pessimist. Earlier this week, he was on MSNBC on the Morning Joe show, talking about what keeps him particularly up at night is a repeat of the Bush versus Gore Supreme Court case in the upcoming election. My guest is Daley. He's a very distinguished writer. He used to be the editor-in-chief of Salon. He's the author of another book called Rat Fucked, which did very well a few years ago. And his new book is Anti-Democratic: Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. David Daley is joining us from his home in Williamsburg in Western Massachusetts. So, David, are you having a lot of sleepless nights these days?
I am comforted by the fact that this election seems to be heading in a direction in which it's not going to be perhaps as close as we thought it might be before. Certainly, there is momentum on the Harris-Walz side. It feels like this week, but there's 90 days to go. And what I think this election needs to stay out of the U.S. Supreme Court is to be a big, decisive election. And if it gets to the U.S. Supreme Court, if we are looking like an election that was as close as it was in the year 2000, when the court really determined who would sit in the White House the next 4 years, I don't think there's really any mystery about which way the John Roberts Leonard Leo court will go. So we're going to have to make sure that this is not a super close election.
David, earlier this week, we also had, and I'm sure you're familiar with his work, Peter Wehner, an old friend of mine on the show. He had a recent New York Times op-ed about the fate of what he called his, which was once his Republican Party, longtime Republican. He no longer is part of the company, worked in both Bush and Reagan White Houses. He's very troubled by, and he's not alone here, the Trumpian populist takeover of the Republican Party. But your new book is different. The subtitle of Anti-Democratic is Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. This is not really about Donald Trump. Explain, in your view, who exactly the far right is, and what is this 50-year plot?
Well, I think that there's a lot of people who believe that the worrisome nature of American democracy started in 2015 when Donald Trump descended down that escalator at Trump Tower and entered the presidential race. And I think that the trouble actually started much earlier. I think that Donald Trump is a symptom of something larger that began in our politics at a much earlier time. And in Anti-Democratic, I try to trace that back into when conservatives really began a war to control the courts. I have two earlier books on voting rights and partisan gerrymandering, trying to tell part of the story of how we got here. And those books are, I think, leading up to this one. And really, this book argues that there was a conservative backlash to the Warren Court, which began the process of really animating the fundamental rights of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that effectively ended the Civil War, ended slavery, assured Black voting rights, began the notion really of equal protection under the law for everybody. And the Reconstruction amendments were eaten alive in many ways by the US Supreme Court in the 1860s and the 1870s. And that is, in many ways, what ushered in the century of Jim Crow that was so violent and involved so many tricks and chicanery, in addition to lynchings and.
Ironically enough, David, you're more of a historian than I am, but in the 19th century, this anti-democratic initiative was initiated by the Democratic Party rather than the Republican Party, wasn't it?
I think that there have been forces in American politics that have been opposed to the idea that a multiracial nation should be a multiracial democracy. And I think it's the force in American politics, that dark force, that really has to be opposed, regardless of which party it is in. Certainly the Civil Rights Act and the civil rights movements in the 1950s and 1960s began, a big realignment of American politics.
Right. So David, let's try and concisely make sense historically of what you're talking about. After the Civil War, as you say, Jim Crow replaced slavery, and Black Americans essentially have their votes taken away from them. This seems, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, would it be fair to say that this was changed, particularly in the 1960s and the Civil Rights era, by the Voting Rights Act of 1965? Is that fair? And perhaps you might explain what exactly LBJ's act did.
The Voting Rights Act is absolutely what put an end to that 100-year period. And the Voting Rights Act is the most effective civil rights legislation in American history. And it worked so well because it had teeth attached to it. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act had something in it called preclearance. And what that did was it effectively told the southern states and localities that they, because of their histories, because of their ingenious defiance of the Constitution over 100 years, that if they wanted to make any changes to their election laws and procedures, they were going to have to run them by the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., or a federal court there. Because there had been that 100-year period in which these amendments had effectively been ignored. And the Voting Rights Act was determined to actually put an end to it. The Civil Rights Acts of 1957, 1959 had tried the same thing. They lacked teeth, and they continued to be defied by judges in the South, by politicians, by sheriffs. And the Voting Rights Act was not going to be ignored.
So let's go back to 1965. We've got this Voting Rights Act, which in your view, and I think most people would agree, I mean, perhaps many Republicans too, that this was a good act. This was, my math tells me, almost 60 years ago. Yeah. Your subtitle is Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot. So what happened between 1965 and the late 70s to initiate what, at least in your view, is a plot to change all this?
Well, the Warren Court, Chief Justice Earl Warren, and the U.S. Supreme Court really defended the Voting Rights Act. And the forces in American politics that were opposed to multiracial democracy were not used to a Supreme Court that were going to stand up and defend this. 1 month after the Voting Rights Act is passed, the state of South Carolina goes to the court and says, well, things are different here now, and all states ought to be considered equal. And we really think that Congress has gone too far. And the Warren Court said, no, that you have ingeniously defied the Constitution, and you're going to be under the thumb of preclearance. And the Warren Court continues to.
There's something sounds. Excuse the childish joke here. There's something rather vulgar about preclearance. Could you explain what exactly it means and why it's so central?
Sure. What it means is that if you're going to change the rules, you have to get it approved first. You're effectively on probation. And this was there because of those previous 100 years when states and localities just ignored the law. So in Dallas County, Alabama, for example, home to Selma and the Pettus Bridge, where John Lewis and so many others were attacked by dogs and tear gas, that really led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. When the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1957, black voting was at 1% in Dallas County registration. By the time of the Voting Rights Act, you'd had 8 years there of successful lawsuits, but the opposition was so high, there was such whack-a-mole being played that black voter registration had only risen to 4%.
Yeah, and that 1 or 4% is really astonishing, given particularly in the 1950s that America was fighting the Cold War on behalf of what it claimed to be democracy. So, okay, so we can't get too lost in the legal weeds, David. So who is leading this reaction against the Voting Rights Act of 1965?
I identify the first key player as a man named Lewis Powell, who is a corporate lawyer in Virginia. And what Powell says is we are being conservatives, big business are being defeated in the courts. He is very nervous about the Warren Court. He's very nervous about the anti-war movement, about the civil rights movement, the environmental and consumer movements of that time, Ralph Nader. And Powell writes a memo in 1970, 1971 for the Chamber of Commerce. And he says, big business and the right has got to get involved in the fight here. And he identifies the courts as the key opportunity. And Powell's memo is extraordinarily influential. It goes to, the Koch brothers are those who have talked about its real-time influence on their donations. It is deeply influential among the Republican billionaire donor class, the Richard Mellon Scaife and the Olin brothers and Joseph Coors and the folks who then fund and create things like the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, the conservative public interest law firms that begin to start in those times.
And they also are, of course, financing Ronald Reagan.
100%. And
right,
they also
David, hold on a second. You're
they
clearly a
name
man.
Lewis Powell.
Sorry, go on.
They name Lewis Powell to the U.S. Supreme Court 3 months after this. So Powell immediately after writing a plan about the importance of the court lands as one of 9 voices on the most important court.
A little bit of the Dick Cheney about that one. I mean, you're clearly a man of the left, a progressive, David, as I am. But is there a legitimate legal argument against the Voting Rights Act of 1965? Or are you suggesting the Powell and the Scaifes and the Heritage Foundation and everyone else you're talking about are essentially trying to turn the clock back to Jim Crow in the 19th century?
I think they are trying to turn the clock back because when John Roberts undoes the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County in 2013, and I'm skipping ahead here, but I mean, John Roberts identifies 2 key arguments in that decision. And they are the exact 2 arguments that the state of South Carolina is claiming in 1966, that things have changed and that we don't need this, and that all states ought to be treated equally, that there is equal sovereignty among states. And Roberts is wrong. There is no equal sovereignty among states. He created this out of whole cloth. There is equal footing, which means that when states are introduced and join the union, they join on equal footing. Roberts takes the equal footing clause, turns it into equal sovereignty among states, calls it a traditional historic notion, and then takes the court's decision from the Katzenbach case, from the South Carolina case in 1966, edits out the piece of it that he doesn't like, I would have gotten an F on a term paper in high school for doing this, and calls it law. So the decision undoing the Voting Rights Act, it stands on phony statistics and on legal error.
But I'm not going to get John Roberts on the show. I'm sure he wouldn't come on. But if he was, he certainly would push back against the idea that he's trying to return to the Confederacy or to Jim Crow. What argument would he make legally?
Well, he would make that equal sovereignty among states would be the number one argument he would make. And then he would say that things have changed, that he would argue that this was necessary in 1965, but was no longer necessary in 2013. He would say that the formula that was being used to determine who would be counted under preclearance was trying to fix an evil from the 1960s that no longer existed in our politics. And I think that the last 10 years has really proven that argument wrong. I would love to see him sit someplace and actually try to make that case, because not 1 hour after John Roberts hands down a decision that says things have changed.
And this, just to be clear, David, I apologize if I'm jumping in a bit too much here.
Nope,
this came out of a case, because not everyone is as legally familiar with this stuff as you. This came out of a case called Shelby County versus Holder in June of 2013. Is that fair?
That's exactly right. Shelby County versus Holder. Yes.
And what did that determine? Why did the Shelby County versus Holder decision by the Supreme Court in 2013, why did that essentially gut the Voting Rights Act of 1965? Because
it put an end to preclearance. It took the enforcement mechanism and it effectively froze the enforcement mechanism. So states no longer had to go to Washington or to the DOJ and get approval for the changes that they wanted to make. Roberts said that was because of equal sovereignty among states and because things had changed and it was no longer necessary. The trouble is that the first part, even conservatives even conservative legal scholars were surprised by the equal sovereignty argument, because Richard Posner, Michael McDonald all said there is no such thing. I don't know what that is. I've never heard of it before. And the idea that things had actually changed in the South and that this was not needed was really proven wrong in the first hour after the decision came down. And all of these states immediately rushed to enact laws that they had not been allowed to do for the previous several decades. And it had a profound effect on our politics.
Well, we're going to address those profound effects in the second half of the show, and remind everyone that we're speaking with David Daley, the author of Anti-Democratic, fascinating new book, Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. It's out this week. I want to remind everyone that great guests like David Daley are brought to us because of our friends at Liberties, an excellent new quarterly of culture and politics. Going to run a short feature on Liberties. And then we'll be back to talk with David Daley about the America after the Shelby County versus Holder decision of the mid-2010s. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. Strongly recommended, as is David Daley's new book, Anti-Democratic Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections, that will chill a lot of people. We've had Carol Anderson on the show making very similar arguments, an old friend of mine in the show. So, David, in the first half of the show, we got up to Shelby County versus Holder, which gutted, if that's the right word, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What has been the result? I mean, the idea of America going back to Jim Crow is an argument that I've heard made on the left, but do you believe that? Is there, to borrow the Michelle Alexander phrase, is there a new Jim Crow when it comes to supposed American democracy after after the Shelby County versus Holder Act?
I think there's a different Jim Crow. I think that obviously we have not returned to the America of lynchings or 1% voter registration.
Or even 4%.
Right. I think that we are in an era instead in which, Jim Crow is not Bull Connor standing outside a school or a voting center with dogs and a fire hose. Instead, Jim Crow is Dr. James Crow, and he has a PhD in statistics, and he is very adept at fashioning barriers that look on their face to be race neutral, but have actually been very carefully and sophisticatedly designed in order to have the result that they want to have. So it's no longer.
David, this person is not Bull Connor, not racist, but they are manipulating the votes on the Republican side, at least, because more African Americans, people of color, vote for the Democrats. But why can't the Democrats do the same thing and play around with the algorithms? Why aren't there figures? I'm guessing there are similar figures within the Democratic Party, PhDs in data science, who are using their expertise to legally try to manipulate the system.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between using, certainly the Obama campaign in 2008, right, was very good at using data science to turn out voters. And I would argue that what is happening on the right instead is an effort to manicure and manipulate the electorate in a way not to create additional turnout or to find your voters, but to make it more difficult for the other side's voters to turn out. So I go back to the Texas voter ID bill that they put into place an hour or two after the Shelby County decision. And what that did, it was a voter ID bill. And voter ID on its face is not necessarily a bad thing. As the arguments go, you show an ID to get on a plane or into an R-rated movie. Not necessarily a bad idea to show a voter ID in order to prove who you are before casting a ballot. Except if you manipulate and twist those laws by trying to determine the precise forms of ID that the other side's voters do not have, and then requiring those. So the state of Texas was forced to admit, and this isn't me, a man of the left, saying this is the state of Texas in litigation, saying that this would have blocked somewhere between 600 and 700,000 Latino voters from casting ballots because they lacked the precise form of ID that the state of Texas was now requiring. These were citizens who were registered voters, but they simply lacked what was now being required by the state of Texas.
What was this? A driving license?
Yes, or all of a sudden in the state of Texas, it was okay to use a hunting license or a gun license, but not a student ID or public housing license. In the state of Alabama, they required a driver's license, and then they closed all of the Department of Motor Vehicles in the Black Belt for just about every day of the month and claimed it was out of out of budget cuts, right?
So this, in your view, is a plot. It's a plot
Yes.
by Southern politicians and
It's
the Republican
intentional, and
Party to take votes, if not the entire vote, but votes away from people of color, from Hispanics, from African Americans.
yes, I think it's intentional. I think it's deliberate. I think it's very sophisticated, and you begin to pile up enough little barriers that people have to step over, and all of a sudden, then they're banging their knee, and then you can't walk into it at all. It's a bunch of minor annoyances, perhaps, to some of us, but when they are targeted at you and they pile up, all of a sudden your precinct keeps moving, or there's fewer voting machines and longer lines where you cast your ballot, or very specific forms of ID are needed, and it's very difficult for you to get those forms. It starts to really add up, especially.
So this
in
is not what
what
Trump was trying to do, or seems trying to do in Georgia, for example, which is basically just cheat the system. This is legal, but what, in your view, immoral, against the principles of democracy?
Against the principles of democracy, but I would say it's newly legal. It's newly legal because the Supreme Court took preclearance away. Before preclearance, these states would not have been able to have gotten away with this, and now they can.
So in a sense, is this the Shelby County versus Holder law or decision is equivalent in some ways to the changes in Roe versus Wade, symbolically, historically?
Yes, I think absolutely. And I think that there are lines that can be drawn from Shelby County to the Dobbs decision. Because one of the things that had to be pre-approved in these states had been their state legislative voting districts and their maps. And so in 2021, these are the first state legislative maps that had not had to have been pre-cleared in places like Alabama and Texas, and states that then enacted, after the Dobbs decision, brand new restrictions on abortion that were out of step with voters in those states. I mean, even in Alabama, even in Texas, right? I mean, red states, but if you look at the polls, the state legislatures in those states enacted bans that voters in those places did not want to see. They were able to do that because maps had been drawn that put more extreme folks in power. Maps had been drawn that limited the voting power of Blacks and Latinos and other minorities, of Democrats. And you go back and you look at the Dobbs decision, right? And Justice Alito is not saying, I'm taking away this right. Alito is saying instead, I am returning a contentious issue of public debate to the people and their elected representatives. Well, what he knew full well was he was returning this to the people and their elected representatives in states that had been gerrymandered so completely that the outcome had been predetermined and that the people actually had very little say. And this was done in part by this same Supreme Court that allowed those gerrymanders to go into effect. So it begins to look like a very sealed system.
Yeah, and John Roberts has generally got a reasonable press, but you're suggesting that he is morally responsible. What about a lot of press, a lot of controversy about Project 2025? Even Donald Trump seems to have distanced himself a little bit from it. Does Project 2025, I'm not sure if you've read it, everyone talks about it without reading it. Does this project, I think it's from the Heritage Foundation, does it build on the Shelby County versus Holder decision? Does it touch on this stuff?
I actually have not read it, but I have read many other versions of this over the years. And one of the things I write about in Anti-Democratic is essentially the Project 2000 version of this. And conservatives are very clear. They say that the issues that we care about the most are going to be decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, and that it's going to be control of the court that determines where all of these questions go. And so in many ways, what I would say is that while John Roberts has this centrist, moderate, institutionalist reputation, that Roberts has been less Chief Justice of the United States than he has been the most effective Republican politician of his generation, because Roberts has delivered victory after victory for conservatives.
Well, he's a
on all of these
conservative,
topics.
David. So that's the nature of things. Just as Warren, I mean, he was a Republican, but he was a liberal Republican, and that's just the nature of the court, isn't it?
I'm not certain it is. I think that he's delivered political policy victories on guns, on voting rights, on campaign finance, on the regulatory state, on the unitary executive theory, that are all out of step with where the country wants to go. And that the plot here is that when you know you are out of step with the country and you do not decide to moderate or change your views, but instead try to impose those views judicially. Abraham Lincoln in his first inaugural, says that if the policies on the most important issues of the day become fixed by the U.S. Supreme Court, he says that the people will have ceased to be their own rulers. And the plot here is to make it so the court is making and imposing these decisions and not the people. And, that to me is deeply anti-democratic.
So David, what is to be done? Joe Biden, in the last months of his administration, seems not shy to articulate a determination to reform the court. It'd be interesting to see where Harris ends up on this one. Are you arguing implicitly, perhaps in anti-democratic, that the bigger issue here is a constitutional rethinking of the nature and size of the Supreme Court?
I think that the question we have to ask ourselves is whether we are comfortable with in whether we call this a democracy or a republic, whether we like the ideas and the decisions that come out of this court or not, whether we think that 9 people ought to have lifetime power.
So should it be 15, or should they only be in power for 20 years or 15 years or 10 years?
I think that term limits, that an ethics standard, that a larger court, that some process that they use in the federal courts right now, in which they randomly draw a panel of judges to hear cases. The idea that we ought to have these fixed 9 people right now who have been effectively handpicked, chosen by presidents who have lost the popular vote, 5 of the 6 conservatives, and then handed lifetime appointments, effectively unaccountable to make their decisions in private, with no ethics standards, that there is something that has become fundamentally wrong here that we have to take a serious look at, or else the people will have ceased to be their own rulers.
Finally, you're involved with Fair Vote, an interesting organization. I think you're a fellow there. In fact, your CEO, Meredith Sumter, is going to be coming on the show in the next few days.
Excellent.
Fair Vote is committed. It's a nonprofit committed to fundamental changes in American democracy, including ranked choice. Is that part of your conclusion as well, David, in anti-democratic, that the American electoral system, after all the arguments you make about the unrepresentative nature of the system, can be extended to the Supreme, to the Electoral College, and to the nature of voting? Does, in your view, the American electoral system, American democracy, require a fundamental overhaul?
I do think we need to be really looking at serious structural fixes. That there is an extremism and a polarization in our politics that is going to be very difficult to break when you are looking, especially, at a U.S. House or state legislatures that are districted and in such a way that you end up with single member winners. That in any system that has been as deeply gerrymandered as state legislatures in the U.S. House, that some of the polarization that has been baked into our politics comes from non-competitive districts in which the only election that matters anymore is a partisan primary, which might be held in June or July. You might get 11, 12% turnout. And because that election matters so much, there might be 9 candidates running. And so people sort of all run to the right, to the or the left, because that's where the most committed voters in that race will be. And then those members are incentivized to behave in ways that are not particularly conducive to governing, and that they're not delivering very well for the American people. So I think you can certainly look at a number of areas in American politics in which the system simply isn't producing the kind of results that we would like to see, that majorities are not being represented, whether that is in state legislatures or the U.S. House or the Supreme Court or the nature of the U.S. Senate right now, the Electoral College, that all of these are topics that have to be taken on very seriously.
Finally, David, a year before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Richard Hofstadter, a distinguished American historian, wrote a wonderful piece for Harper's called "The Paranoid Style in American Politics." Are you concerned that books like yours only compound that paranoia? I mean, I'm not sure if you came up with the subtitle of your book, Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. If Trump is indeed elected in November, it's quite conceivable. They're running neck and neck at the moment, as in 2016. Is the paranoia on both sides? And many progressives will claim that the election was stolen one way or the other. Do we, perhaps, maybe rephrasing this question, do we all need to hold up our hands and say, look, no system's completely fair, but we've all got to play by the rules?
I think that would be tremendous. I think we certainly need to dial down the heat in American politics, but this is not a Jeremiah. I consider Hofstadter a historian I greatly look up to and would like to be more in line. I consider him to be, certainly an ally in this. I think what I'm describing is in many ways the manifestation of what he wrote about, still very much with us, and that there has been a real effort to take the animating spirit of the Reconstruction amendments of the Voting Rights Act, that to me are the very best of what America should be, of what American democracy ought to be, and to turn that on its head. We are a multiracial nation. The question of whether we can be a multiracial democracy is, to me, the question that is going to be at the heart of the American future. And I think it's an undecided question, and that there are forces on both sides of that fight, and that the outcome remains deeply uncertain.
Well, David Daley, author, anti-democratic, fascinating new book about the problems with the American electoral system. Congratulations on the book, and we'll definitely try to get you back on the show before the election to determine what the impact of all these legal changes have been on the election. Thank you so much, and congratulations again on an excellent new book.
Thank you so much.
And David, of course, hope you get some sleep.
I hope we all do.
Staying up all night worrying about America. America has other people who can worry about them. You need to sleep.
Thank you so much.